All right, buckle up for this one. We're going deep on a case that really turns the tables on what we think we know about serial
Oh,
killers.
yeah. Lay it on me.
We're talking Terry Childs, a California killer active in the late 70s and 80s. Now, here's the kicker. He confessed to a bunch of murders, claiming he was being haunted by one of his victims.
Whoa, okay. That's a new one. Definitely not your run-of-the-mill serial killer story.
Nope, not even close.
Yeah.
So we've dug up everything we could find, articles, court records, even some biographical info to try and untangle this whole mess.
So we're trying to figure out, is this, like, genuine guilt? Some crazy legal tactic? What are we dealing with here?
That's the million-dollar question. Is he truly remorseful, or is there something else at play? To get a handle on this, let's start with Terry Childs himself. Born in 1955, and, well, let's just say he had a rough start. Drugs, petty crime, you name it. Things escalated to robbery as he got older. There's even this chilling detail about his brother being killed in prison, murdered by another inmate.
Oof, that's heavy. So violence was kind of baked into his environment from early on. Makes you wonder how much that shapes a person.
Yeah, almost like a blueprint for his own life. But let's get to the crime that first landed him behind bars. The Los Segala case back in 1985.
Oh, yeah, that one was brutal. Lois Segala, just 17 years old, shot 15 times with a Luger. Just a senseless tragedy.
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, Childs forced his girlfriend at the time to help him cover up the evidence. I mean, talk about control and manipulation on top of everything else.
Textbook case, unfortunately. Perpetrators often try to control their victims even after the crime. It's a way to maintain power, silence witnesses. So what happened at the trial? How did things play out with Child's girlfriend?
She ended up becoming a key witness for the prosecution. The pressure was just too much, and she spilled the beans on Child's motive. He was convinced Segala was going to rat him out for a robbery.
So paranoia led to violence. Sadly, that's not a unique story either.
Not at all. But here's where things take a turn. The prosecution painted Childs as this sadistic guy, someone who got off on inflicting pain. But the defense came back swinging with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, claiming that this mental illness basically warped his sense of reality.
Okay, so that raises some serious questions about his legal responsibility, right?
Big time. I mean, if he genuinely couldn't distinguish between what was real and what wasn't, how can you hold him fully accountable for his actions?
It's a tough question. Paranoid schizophrenia, it's a serious mental illness, and it can manifest in some pretty intense ways. Delusions, hallucinations, the whole 9 yards.
Right, so the defense argued that his mental state made it impossible for him to form intent, to fully grasp the consequences of his actions.
It's basically arguing that his illness, not his free will, was driving the bus, so to speak. And that can have a huge impact on how the law views culpability.
So, with these two completely different narratives on the table, what did the jury make of it all?
Well, after a lot of back and forth, they ended up siding with the prosecution, finding Childs guilty, and hitting him with a life sentence. Possibility of parole after 41 years.
Whoa, so that's it, right? Case closed.
Not so fast. This is just Act 1. Things are about to get a whole lot more complicated.
Oh boy, I can't wait to hear where this goes next.
So picture this. Terry Childs is locked up in Pelican Bay, about as tough as prisons get, and out of nowhere, he starts offering up confessions.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher, for sure. Was this a genuine change of heart, guilt getting the better of him? Or was there something else going on? Was he trying to work the system somehow?
Right. Everyone's asking those same questions. To get a handle on this, we got to look at the confessions themselves. One of the first he offered up was for the murder of Rulon McGill. Happened back in 1979 in Nevada.
So this wasn't a case that was already on everyone's radar. It wasn't like he was confessing to something that was already front page news.
Nope, it had gone cold. What's really interesting is the level of detail Childs gave. He didn't just say, yeah, I did it. He pointed to the exact spot where her remains were found, using a map. He even described specific things about the crime scene that hadn't been released to the public, details only the investigators would know.
Whoa, okay, so this wasn't just some vague admission. He had insider knowledge, it sounds
You
like.
got it. Enough to corroborate his story, officially link him to the McGill murder, and raise a whole lot of eyebrows about the other murders he was claiming. Which, of course, brings us to the confession that really kicked off this whole deep dive.
Yeah, the murder of Linda Ann Krozovich. This one captured everyone's attention, not just for how brutal it was, but for that eerie twist in Child's confession.
Absolutely. Linda Ann was just 19 when she vanished from a department store parking lot back in 1979. Imagine what her family went through, all those years without answers, not knowing what happened to her.
Just Awful. And to make matters worse, it took forever for her remains to be found. First, in 1995, they found a jawbone and some ribs up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And then, in 2004, they located the rest of her remains near the Lexington Reservoir. I mean, can you imagine the agony of that wait? And then finally getting confirmation, but knowing she was murdered.
It's hard to even fathom, and this is where Child's confession takes this really strange turn. He claimed to have killed Josevich, and not just killed her, but beaten, tortured, strangled, and stabbed her.
Hold up, that's not all. This is where it gets truly bizarre. He claimed he was being haunted by her ghost.
Yeah.
Said that's what drove him to confess.
Yeah, he claimed to be having these terrible nightmares, couldn't sleep, had all these health problems, and he kept saying it was Josevich's ghost tormenting him, demanding that he confess.
Okay, wait a minute. Are we talking like she was rattling chains and showing up in mirrors? Because that changes things a lot.
Well, the details of what he claimed are a bit murky, but the gist of it was he felt supernaturally punished for what he did. Like the only way to get any peace was to confess.
I gotta say, my skeptical side is kicking in here. He'd just gotten himself transferred out of Pelican Bay, using that McGill confession as leverage. So could this whole haunting story be another tactic? Another way to manipulate the system, maybe get some sympathy?
You're not wrong to wonder about that. It's definitely possible. But we also have to consider maybe he really was going through some sort of psychological break. I mean, this guy was not exactly stable to begin with.
Man, this is one tangled web we're weaving here. It's like every time we think we've got a grip on things, another layer pops up.
You said it. And guess what? There's even more to this story. Childs didn't stop with those two confessions.
Seriously. He confessed to even more. It's almost like a twisted game of one-upmanship.
Yeah. In 2016, he added two more to the list. Joan Leslie Mack and Christopher Hall, both killed in Aptos, California in 1984 and 85, respectively. And get this, he even claimed he was responsible for his father's fiance's death back in 74.
Wow, okay. So, we're left with a mountain of questions here. Why confess to all these other murders, years, even decades later? Was it genuine remorse? Was he just trying to get attention? Or was there something else entirely going on? I mean, what was the real motive here?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It gets to the heart of what makes this case so fascinating. And as we head into the final part of this deep dive, we'll try to unpack those motivations, see what they might reveal about the mind of a killer who claimed to be haunted by his own victims. So we're left trying to make sense of these confessions. Was it genuine remorse, a desire to clear his conscience, or was it all just a twisted game to Terry Childs?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing we can't overlook is the impact these confessions had on the families of the victims. Imagine getting that news after all those years.
Right. It's got to be a roller coaster of emotions. On the one hand, it's closure, confirmation that their loved one's case wasn't forgotten. But on the other hand, knowing it might have been part of some scheme to manipulate the system to get better treatment.
It's like a double whammy. It makes you question everything.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really tough question. Does the motivation behind a confession, does it affect its validity in court? I mean, if it helps solve a crime, bring a perpetrator to justice, does it really matter why they confessed?
That's a good question. Tough one to answer. But I guess if a confession is coerced or, like you said, part of some kind of bargain, then it feels different.
Right. It feels like it undermines the whole idea of justice. And with Childs, with his history of manipulation and then that whole ghost story, man, it's impossible to know what was real and what wasn't.
It's one giant gray area. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the twists and turns of this case, the whole ghost story angle. But at the end of the day, this is about real people, real victims.
Absolutely. And their families who are left to pick up the pieces. It's a stark reminder that behind every headline, every court case, there's a very human story of loss and pain.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life and crimes of Terry Childs, what are we left with? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think it highlights the importance of critical thinking. We can't just take confessions at face value, especially when we're dealing with someone like Childs who had a history of manipulation.
Right. We got to look deeper at the context, the motives, the psychology involved.
Exactly. And it underscores the need for thorough investigations. It's not enough to just get a confession. You have to corroborate the evidence. Look for other motives that might be at play.
It's a reminder that the human mind is a complicated thing. Whether Childs' claims of being haunted were real, delusional, or just another tactic, they show just how twisted things can get inside the mind of a killer.
And that, I think, is one of the biggest takeaways from this deep dive. It forces us to confront the dark side of human nature, the depths of deception and manipulation that some people are capable of.
So as we close the book on Terry Childs, we're left with more questions than answers. Did his confessions bring closure to the families of the victims? Or did they just add another layer of pain and uncertainty? Were his claims of being haunted a sign of true remorse or just another calculated move in his twisted game?
Hmm.
I guess we'll never really know for sure.
But by exploring these questions, by digging into the dark corners of this case, we've hopefully learned something about the complexities of the criminal justice system, the dark side of human nature, and how slippery the idea of truth can really be.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the life and crimes of Terry Childs, a case that's both fascinating and disturbing, leaving us with a lot to think about.